War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 76, the Spanish Armada. I would love to continue my unscripted ramblings as I have moved yet again, but hopefully for the last time. However, discipline demands I write a script on a really interesting naval battle that certainly shaped Western civilization and, unquestionably, the United States. Spain and England had been, for decades, allies against a strong French presence. But this alliance was broken by an unsurprising combination of intertwined familial ties as well as religion, and a refusal of kings and queens to properly reproduce the requisite male heirs to the throne. This happening in both England and Spain and leading to this conflict. For a little bit of context, when Isabella, the Queen of Spain, died in 1504, yes, the same queen who brilliantly funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus, we yet again celebrate this year, the succession was unclear. After a series of various intrigues and changing rulers, eventually Charles rose to the throne in 1506 as a young boy. Charles was from the Habsburgs and, in 1519, became the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. As such, he had responsibilities not just for Spain, but for his empire as well as all of Catholicism. He was the most powerful man in Europe at this point, and when Charles died, his kingdom and empire went to his son, Philip II. Returning to England, Henry VIII ruled until 1547, and tried valiantly and murderously to conceive a male heir. Prior to his success in finally conceiving the future Edward VI, his daughter Mary was born and later married to the aforementioned Philip II. During this time, Henry was vigorously supporting the Protestant Reformation, which, you can well imagine, was not well received by the Holy Roman Emperor. When Henry died, Edward assumed the throne and then had the temerity to die with no heir. Mary, the oldest daughter of Henry, assumed the throne in 1553 and married Philip in 1556. She was most certainly not a Protestant, and indeed, upon the insistence of her new husband Philip, engaged in a disastrous war against France, which ended up finally losing the last English possession in France, Calais, in 1558. Philip, by virtue of his genitalia, was by his marriage to Mary also King of England. Mary, having married late, never had a child and died in 1558, some say heartbroken over her failure in France, and was succeeded by her half-sister and confirmed Protestant, Elizabeth. Philip was a bit peeved. The re-Catholicism of England had ended, and to make matters worse from the papal perspective, Henry's divorce of Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was never recognized by the Catholic Church, so Elizabeth was an illegitimate bastard. So Philip openly supported King James V of Scotland's daughter, Mary, a different one, to assume the throne based upon her status as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. This drama and intrigue, which caused several attempted coups and overthrows of Elizabeth's crown, eventually led to Mary, Queen of Scots, to be executed in 1587, with enough plausible deniability by Queen Elizabeth as to whether or not she actually ordered the execution. At this, Philip was determined to reclaim England for the Pope and himself, and initiated earlier plans to invade. Other motivations included English support for the Dutch rebellion, as well as English pirates attacking and seizing Spanish ships in the New World. Plans to invade previously were delayed due to the cost involved in both ships and men. As such, a direct invasion from Spain was rejected for a plan to sail north to Spanish assets in the lowlands. The Netherlands literally translates to lowlands. The Duke of Parma was initially consulted by Philip II in 1583. Parma stressed that three conditions would need to be met to achieve success: absolute secrecy, secure possession and defense of the Dutch provinces, and keep the French from interfering. Philip ultimately combined Parma's plan with that of Santa Cruz, initially entertaining a triple attack, starting with the diversionary raid on Scotland, while the main armada would capture either the Isle of Wight or Southampton to establish a safe anchorage. Parma would then follow with a large army from the Low Countries crossing the English Channel. The appointed commander of naval forces in the Armada was the highly experienced Marquis of Santa Cruz, while Parma would be in command of the invasion forces. Unfortunately, Santa Cruz died in February 1588, and the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a highborn courtier, took his place. While a competent soldier and distinguished administrator, Medina Sidonia had no naval experience. He wrote to Philip expressing grave doubts about the planned campaign, but his message was prevented from reaching the king by other courtiers on the grounds that God would ensure the Armada's success. Philip must have assumed that the Spanish dominance of the seas would carry the day over his naval commander's inexperience. The fleet of the day was relatively large and much like today's fleet. The ship count reflects not only warfighters, otherwise known as ships of the line, but far more support ships. The Armada left Lisbon, Portugal and Spain were united at the time, for Holland, and reinforcements with 141 ships of well over a dozen different types. There were 10,000 sailors and roughly double that amount of soldiers. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, another 60,000 soldiers awaited with 3,500 cavalry under the command of Parma. Several smaller ships abandoned the effort for various reasons. The ignorance of Medina Sidonia soon became apparent. He had no idea that the British and Dutch could counter his fleet. He assumed he would ferry the 60,000-man army, huge for that time, across the channel unopposed, in flat-bottomed, light flyboats. Now he had to develop a mechanism to clear the enemy fleet and gain, pointing back to Corbett, sea control across the channel. The English fleet sat at anchor in Plymouth, awaiting word of the approach of the Armada, which was soon sighted, and beacons warned the fleet of the imminent arrival. The Spanish convened a council of war and proposed to attack the English fleet in harbor when the incoming tide would trap them and give easy approach from the sea to the Spanish. However, Philip gave explicit orders not to engage the English fleet and to first link up with Parma and his awaiting 60,000. This would prove to be the decisive, although clearly not the only, mistake of the campaign. Instead, the fleets met in open ocean outside Plymouth, with the Spanish taking a defensive crescent, the center and horns occupied by their galleons and ships of the line, with the supply ships and freighters huddled between them. The naval tactics of the day were largely comprised of boarding and seizing, as opposed to pummeling by cannon fire. While the Spanish had thousands of cannon, the intent was to fire but once to clear the decks of defending marines and sailors, and then grapple in board. The English, outmanned but not outsailed, declined this form of engagement and, having gained the wind advantage, aka weather gauge, raked the passive Spanish fleet with cannon fire, aiming not for the men on deck, but for the waterline in hopes of penetrating the hull and sinking the ships. It was later discovered that the Spanish ships were almost incapable of reloading during the fight, so tight were the confines of the gun decks and the arrangement of the magazines. The first engagement was indecisive, but ended with the Spanish sailing off in the darkness, pursued by the English. The fleets met again 2 days later off the island of Wight, with the English led by the privateer Sir Francis Drake. This time the winds favored the Spanish, but the English managed to avoid decisive engagement, and in the chaos of maneuvering, several Spanish ships collided and were damaged, allowing them to be isolated and seized by the English, to include one galleon loaded with 50,000 gold coins, a future pay for the army and navy now transferred to the financially strapped English. The Spanish fleet managed to make its way to the no longer English Calais, where they anchored close to Parma at Dunkirk, whose massed army was suffering from disease, weather, and supply issues, while awaiting their opportunity to invade. While equipped with lightly armed ships, the Dutch, sailing in their own waters, kept Parma's army trapped with but few lightly armed coastal ships. With the Spanish immobile off Calais, Drake determined to attack with fireboats. Rather than the dedicated ships loaded with gunpowder, however, he simply took existing ships doused with pitch and combustibles, set them alight, and let them sail using the favorable winds right into the midst of the Spanish fleet. Not a single ship was lost to these fireboats, but, aside from the flagship of the Spanish, the rest of the fleet cut their anchors and fled in terror downwind. The close formation that the Spanish relied on for mutual defense was broken, and the winds refused to allow them to reorganize. Drake and the English recognized the opportunity and closed on the Spanish, now off the coast of the port of Gravelines. The Spanish dare not approach closer to shore due to hazards. With Medina incapable of reforming his defensive crescent, and the English windward, Drake would sail in with 100 yards, fire a broadside, and sail off. His fleet repeated this tactic throughout the day until his ammunition stores were exhausted. The Spanish were, as noted, incapable of reloading in a timely manner, and the low-aimed broadsides had decimated its trained gunners. Infantry on deck were pressed into action on the guns, which caused its own problems and chaos. Musket volleys and various epithets were exchanged above deck, as the fleets closed and departed over and over. While only 5 Spanish ships were lost during the engagement, several more were severely damaged to 0 losses for the English. The Spanish were broken and abandoned their attempted invasion. Survival of the remaining fleet became the objective. Feeling the direct southern approach to return to Spain unavailable, the Spanish determined to make for Scotland and then through the Irish Sea or west of Ireland down the Atlantic coast. As the 110 ships of the original Armada made the turn on the northern tip of Scotland, turbulent winds forced them to close to the coast. As most had lost their anchors at Calais, they were helpless, and at least 24 more were lost to the storms and rocky coast. The ships themselves were in a horrid state, having stayed afloat far longer than planned. Provisions were scant and ropes used to keep the hulls together. Crews combined as ships were lost, leading to one ship losing 1,300 people on board after sinking with less than 10 survivors. It is hard to imagine in modern times, but Spain had no idea what had happened to her fleet until over a month later when the first survivors sailed into port. Approximately 70 ships of the original 120 made the final voyage back to Spain, but 9,000 of the 2,500 who departed were killed by disease, combat, or the sea. The Duke of Parma, with his 60,000 men, decided to do something with his army, and that something was divide them up into 3 groups, all of whom were defeated in their objectives. Of his 60,000, 10,000 were killed due to combat or disease. The English, while decisively victorious, still suffered, themselves mostly from disease. One ship with a crew of 500 lost 200 to scurvy and typhus. Some have surmised that Queen Elizabeth kept the fleet together well after the victory to reduce the number of men to be paid. As far as the ramifications of the battle, and why Creasy included it in his 15 decisive battles, England remained Protestant and outside the grasp of the Holy Roman Empire. In naval tactics, it was a revolution. Ramming and boarding had forever been abandoned to naval gunfire and seamanship. A premium was now on sailors who could quickly rig a ship versus those who could well wield a cutlass or mace. Gunnery and sustained firepower preferred to a massive volley of a single blast. Speed was more important than size, and here the English shipbuilders would retain an advantage that would last until the 20th century. Operationally and strategically, it reinforced the primacy of naval operations for expeditionary warfare. Spain's failure was in not controlling the sea as its first priority. Had the Spanish struck the harbor-bound English in Plymouth, this blow would have probably carried the day, and with it, changed the course of Western civilization. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.